Let's start now with the second great skill of guard retention. This is the skill of forming frames between myself and my opponent. Understand something. Every battle for guard retention is essentially always the same kind of battle. It's a battle to control distance between myself and my opponent. When my opponent is passing my guard, regardless of the kind of pass he's using, essentially what he's looking to do is close distance. That distance starts with some kind of grip. My opponent gets to an angle, and then from there, it's a battle between his ability to bring his head and chest close to my head and chest, and my ability to resist that and recover the position of my legs. Okay? So once again, the whole cycle, the general picture of guard passing is first an attempt to get around my legs, usually through grip and angle, and then close distance between his upper body and my upper body. The most obvious way in which we get to see this battle for distance is the relationship between his head, his lead shoulder, and his chest, because those three will form a trinity of body parts: head, lead shoulder, and chest, which will determine whether he passes my guard or not. So once he's passed the barrier of my legs, it's all about this aspect of distance, measured by the position of his head relative to mine, his lead shoulder, and his chest to my chest. My ability to hold him off once he gets past the barrier of my legs comes down to my ability to form temporary frames with my arms, hands, forearms, and even the back of my hands. We'll be talking a lot more about frames in the next few segments, but that's always going to be the general picture of the battle. Once my opponent clears my legs, forms an angle on my opponent, every battle for guard retention is going to come down to that battle for distance. He's going to be looking to restrict or take away distance, and I'm going to be looking to maintain distance. If I can maintain distance, I can move my legs back into position and get back with my center line lined up with his and retain my guard. If I can't, chances are I'm going to get my guard passed. So frames, these temporary barriers utilizing my upper body, are one of the key aspects of all forms of guard retention. They give you a stopgap measure where you can hold your opponent off for brief periods of time so you can recover your legs. Now understand something about framing. It's a battle of your arms against your opponent's whole body. So it would be very unrealistic indeed to think that if someone went to go past my guard, that I could use a frame to push him back. That is not the idea behind framing. The idea behind framing is to form a mechanically strong enough structure that I can hold someone in place for a short period of time. We are not interested in the idea of pushing people backwards. That is not what we're doing with framing. Rather, we form a mechanically strong structure so that for a brief period of time I can hold someone and then recover the legs. I push people back with my legs, never with my frames. You must understand this key point. In beginners classes all over the country, you'll see people pushing people with frames. No, you don't push people with frames. You hold people with frames for a short period of time until you can recover legs. And you do a pushing and motion with the legs, not with your arms. If you try to push with frames, you're going to quickly get frustrated, tired, and you'll find that your arms almost always prove inadequate to push someone your own size and strength back from these mechanically disadvantageous positions. The idea behind frames is that they are a temporary stopgap holding measure, not an opportunity to bench press people from bottom position. As a result, most frames involve some kind of mechanically strong position, such as a locked arm, so that alignment holds my opponent off, or an arm connected to my torso, an arm in a mechanically strong position where I use the upper arm and elbow and upper forearm to hold people off. So we use mechanical strength to hold people rather than muscular strength to push people. That's extremely important. I'm going to say it again. Whenever we go to form frames, we want to use mechanical strength based around principles of body alignment to hold people and then move behind those frames rather than to use muscular strength to push people back and try to put people in guard. So let's always make sure that when we go to frame, I'm going to demonstrate one kind of frame, a very basic one. We never use a bent arm in these situations and try to take a bent arm and straighten it and push people back. This will never work in competition, okay? Rather, we take them onto a straight aligned arm. So because there's alignment here, it's relatively strong structure. The arm becomes progressively weaker when my hand comes in like so. Think about bench press, where you can hold a very heavy weight for long periods of time if your arms are extended. But if you bring your arms down towards your own body, that weight soon becomes very, very heavy indeed. So we form a mechanically strong structure. We move behind that structure and we hold it just long enough that we can bring our legs into play. And it's with our legs that we start doing all of our strong mechanical work. Ultimately, we want to wrestle our opponent as much as possible with our legs. We use our frames simply as a temporary method of holding someone, and we move our body behind those frames so we can put them back in guard. These frames form, as it were, the shield of the guard retainer. When you see an incoming blow, you hold up a shield and protect yourself. Those frames form that same kind of philosophy or idea. Whenever we see an offense coming towards us in guard, there's a temporary shield, and we move behind our shield so we can realign our legs with our opponent and get back into the guard game. Now, we're talking about the skill of framing on an opponent, forming a temporary barrier once my opponent is past my legs so that we can recover our legs behind the frame and get back into the game. Understand something about frames. There are a wide variety of frames, and the single biggest determinant of which one I choose, since you have many different options, is the distance between myself and my opponent. Probably the first frame that most people make use of are those which operate at the longest distance. Okay, these will be what we call forehand frames. I have an opponent who gets a hold of my legs and starts moving to the side. There's still quite a bit of distance between myself and my opponent, so I use a forehand placed on the part of my opponent's body that is closest to me, which is his lead shoulder. Remember, this lead shoulder will be the part of his body that comes to my body first. As he comes around the corner, that lead shoulder leads the way and makes contact with my chest. So that's the first part of his body, which is going to end up in the chest-to-chest position. And that accordingly is the one I've got to stop first. So we put out a forehand frame. When he goes to bring the lead shoulder forward, it goes onto my locked hands. Now, am I going to be able to hold someone forever like this? Nope. There's definitely some counters there for him to get past this forehand frame. But it can create a temporary barrier, which will enable me to bring my legs into play. And from here, when you can now fight our opponent with the strength of our legs and go back to alignment and put him back in guard. Now you can see this is the longest frame that I have because it functions at the extreme length of my arms. Okay, so as my opponent comes around my guard, that'll be the first one that we make use of. He comes back in the opposite direction, and from here, that'll be the first one that we make use of. Notice that all frames are at their maximum effectiveness when my elbow and knee are close together. The further my elbow and knee come apart, the more I'm relying on an isolated frame. Now, it's not wrong to be like this. This can be effective, but it's not desirable. Most of the time, we like to see situations where elbow and knee are close together and supporting each other. And it's from here that typically most of our easiest guard retention strategies work. This ability on our part to work with elbows and knees close together is a big, big part of our framing. And the longest distance frame we have is the classic forehand frame, where my opponent comes around and comes onto a hand like so. Understand that among the forearm frames, there are two main varieties. There are single frames, like so, a single forehand, and there are double forehands. Okay? As my opponent comes around the corner now, two hands are blocking him at the shoulder, and as a result, we'll have a slightly stronger frame from which we can go to work. Forehand frames constitute the the long-range artillery of framing, so to speak. They maximize the distance between you and your opponent. They're kind of like the jab of frames. You can keep your opponent out at distance using two hands or one hand, and they indeed are very, very useful, and probably the first frame that you'll be making use of, and the one you'll be making use of the most. Now, we're looking at the idea of framing. We've seen that the first frames we make use of are those which generate the longest distance between myself and my opponent, and the forehand frame is the longest distance we have, the distance of our arm. The next one we're going to look at is a forearm frame, where we halve the distance between myself and my opponent. So now my opponent has gotten closer to me. He's gotten past my hands. He now comes on to my forearms. There's good news and bad news. The bad news is he's closer to you. That's not a good thing in guard retention. There's less distance to work with. But the good news is you are now using the structure of your upper arm and shoulder to hold him off, so you can bear a much greater weight. So you've sacrificed distance, but you've gained strength. Let's have a look at the forearm frame in various ways. As my opponent goes past my legs and distance starts to decrease between us, I can use my forearm. Now, interestingly, even if Mateus starts driving his weight in towards me, the structure of this position is quite impressive. You can hold people even as they get in, putting considerable weight on you. And as a result, we'll be able to bring our legs back in and go into retain our guard. So as distance decreases and my opponent gets past the hands, our next line of defense will be our forearms. And you can see that the distance between myself and my opponent is now half what it was for a forehand frame. The forearm frame is considerably stronger, and it's easy to combine the forearm with the knee to create very strong structures indeed. Mateus comes around to my side, and we just put your chest on my chest. You can see that I can easily hold my training partner's entire body weight on two forearm frames. This is an easy thing for anyone to do. Even when someone is considerably heavier than yourself, you can hold people for very long periods of time. Mechanically, it's a very, very strong and robust form of framing as we unite the forearms and the knees. So as someone comes around our body and distance closes, look how we can place a forearm just in like so. And by keeping knee and elbow close together, it's a relatively easy thing. Bring legs in, and from here we can start forming an effective frame on our opponent. These represent the second range or second distance when it's time to form effective frames on someone who's gotten past our legs. They do sacrifice distance. They have half the distance reach of a forehand frame, but they have roughly twice the strength, and they form our second tier of defense as someone comes past our legs. Notice that forearm frames come in two varieties. We have, as an opponent comes around, conventional method where we block just in like so. And we also have inverted methods. Someone comes in close and we can place a forearm in with the hand pointing downwards. And from here, we can go to create distance and put people back in guard. So the two main varieties are up versions where my hand goes up, and down versions where my hand comes in like so, and we can form space between myself and my opponent. Typically, the vast majority of cases, we form our frames with our hand facing upwards. As my opponent comes around the corner, it's by far and away the more common form of frame, like so. But there is a use, especially in seated positions, when someone comes around the corner, for frames where our hand points downwards, and we can scoot and put someone back in guard. These two forms of forearm frame form the second line of defense. If the forehand is the first line of defense because of its incredible distance and reach, the forearm forms a very useful second tier of defense, shorter distance, but very robust and very strong. A big part of your ability to frame people and put them back in guard. Now, let's look at a third method of framing that doesn't get much discussion, but it's extremely important. This is the closest of all the frames. This is the one which is, as it were, your last line of defense. If the forehand frame is your first line of defense and your forearm frame is the second line, The last one is the backhand frame. In a backhand frame, I put my hand on my own chest. Or, another version of it, I put my hand on my own head, like so. So in other words, the palms of my hands make contact with my own body. These frames are designed when there is almost no space between myself and my opponent, and we're going into a crisis situation where my opponent has passed my guard and brought his whole body very, very close to mine. And now this is a crisis. If there's no frame now, he's going to pass. He's across your side. Okay, so this is your last line of defense, and it requires almost no distance because the distance involved is the width of your hand. If someone goes to control my head, I put a hand up like so, and now I have the inside position in a frame. If someone goes to put their chest on my chest, I put my hand on my own chest, so they don't land on my chest, they land on my hand. And as a result, I'm going to be able to go underneath and score an underhook on my opponent. I'm going to demonstrate first the backhand on my own chest. We're going to come close to the camera, and Mateus is going to be right here. Let's look at a situation where Mateus closes past, and he's gotten his lead shoulder very close to me, and I can feel, just freeze right there, Mateus. He's come close enough, get a little closer, buddy, that I cannot get my forearm frame in place, and I feel he's going to pass my guard. Immediately, I put my hand on my own chest, and I put my hand here on my own head. So as Mateus lands across my side on my chest and goes to control my head, I get the inside frame. I don't surrender the head. I never want my opponent controlling my head. Okay? So my hand goes on my own head so that I control the inside position. Now, my hand is on my chest. So when Mateus comes up on top, chest to chest, he never gets true chest to chest. He gets chest on hand. And as a result, I can move underneath my opponent and avoid the situation and go back into the safety of guard or what have you. Okay? I can never give two things for free. I can never give my head to my opponent, and I can never give true chest-to-chest position on my opponent. If he gets those two things, it's very, very hard to hold someone off. So the last line of defense in framing is always going to be hand on our own head, hand on our own chest. Again, my training partner comes around my legs and gets so close to me, there's a danger now. He's going to land on my chest and get control of my head. And as those two things happen, it's very, very hard for me now to put him back in guard. This is going to be very difficult. Okay, you can do it, but it's going to be tough. It's much easier for me to recognize he's about to pass, and I put myself in these two frames. So when he goes to my head, I'm inside. When he goes to my chest, my arm is underneath. And as a result, he can quickly come up, and from this position, it's a lot easier for me to sit back down and go in and retain my guard. Okay? Backhand frames represent the last line of defense. They are used when the distance between you and your opponent has really diminished and there's almost nothing left to work with. In that tiny space, the backhand frame requires only the width of your hand, a tiny, tiny distance. And it's a very easy thing as someone gets close just to put that strong defensive structure in place so that now you get inside their crossface and underneath their arm. If someone lands on top of me and I'm underneath their arm, they never really control me in this position. When Mateus gets coming down this way, when Mateus gets underneath my arm on this side, this is a serious problem because now he can pin my shoulder to the mat. It's very, very hard for me to get up underneath him now. But if I hit the undergrip, the underhook like so, it's very easy for me to turn my body underneath him and go back into some form of guard position. Okay? So we never give up that pure chest-to-chest contact, and we never just give up control of our head. If our opponent gets control of our head and our chest, it's because he earned it, not because we gave it to him for free. And the best way to prevent giving it away for free is the backhand frame, which makes it easier to take the inside position and get up underneath our opponent. Remember, I don't fear my opponent's weight on my chest per se. I fear his ability to get inside position on me. That's what I'm concerned about. Mateus can have all his weight on top of me, chest to chest, past my guard. But if he doesn't have the inside position, he can't use it effectively. Right now he has chest to chest position, but I'm inside his limbs with an underhook on one side and an inside tie on the other. So even though he's chest to chest, it's very easy for me to move his body weight. And as a result, we can move effectively underneath him. I don't fear his body weight. I fear his ability to form effective wedges inside my limbs so that his body weight can hold me. But if I consistently get those backhand frames, he'll never get inside position on me. And even as he gets chest-to-chest contact, or something close to it, the appearance of chest-to-chest contact, what he really has is chest-on-hand contact. And I can move underneath him, move his body weight quite easily through good limb positioning, and get up to retain my guard. Backhand frames form the last line of defense, and they're a very, very effective and not often discussed part of your overall framing methodology. Now, all the frames that we've talked about so far, forehand frames, forearm frames, and backhand frames, have been frames that ultimately I put upon my opponent. But there's also another kind of frame where I don't frame my opponent, I frame myself. And these two are a vital part of guard retention. Let's have a look at a situation where Mateus has, for example, a Toreando type pass. When he goes to pass, ultimately what Mateus is trying to do is to get my knees pointed away from him. If my feet and knees point at Mateus, he'll never pass my guard. So what he wants to do is make my knees and feet point away so that he can go around knees and feet and start to pass. Do you see what is happening? If we come around in this direction, you can see my knees are currently facing the ceiling. But if Mateus makes my knees point out in this direction, it's very, very hard for me to retain guard under these circumstances. Why? He's done such a good job of making my far knee point away that now it's going to be very difficult for me. Even if he let go at this point, it would still be difficult for me to put him back in guard. Why was it so easy for Mateus to pass my guard under those circumstances? Because he made my knees face away. If you look at my current body structure, there's no support for my knees. And as a result, he just puts two hands on my gi pants, makes them face, and look how easily my knees face away, and so simple for him to pass my guard. But you can change that by framing your own legs. As Mateus goes to push my knees to the side, I just put a frame on the floor on my own leg. This puts a limit on how far he can make my knees face away. As he comes around the corner, now I can post on the opposite side. So I have a post on him and a frame on myself. Now, as he goes to push my legs aside, go. It's very difficult. And as a result, much easier to put my opponent back in guard. Now let's contrast that with a situation where Mateus comes around, I post on him, but I have nothing on my legs. Now, it's difficult, my arm begins to fold, and I lose control of my opponent. So it's important that we don't just frame on him, but we also frame on ourselves to put a limit on how far our knees can move. So as Mateus gets a hold of me and goes to throw my legs by, look how we can hold the man off and recover our legs. And from here, we're back in the safety of guard. There are many, many opportunities to use framing upon your own body to prevent your opponent from whipping your legs by and making your knees point off in directions that suit him and don't suit you. Don't forget to use frames on your own body to add robustness to your structure. It's not just about framing him, it's about framing yourself as well. Now, there's a third skill of guard retention, which is absolutely crucial to your ability to hold off a strong guard passer and keep your guard against his best attempts to pass. This has to do with the fact that almost every form of guard pass involves some form of prerequisite grip. So if you can fight your opponent's grips and either break them or at the least negate them, you're going to be able to find it a lot easier to hold off your opponent's attempts to pass your guard. Let's have a look at Mateus going in to pass our guard. Regardless of the type of guard pass that Mateus uses, it's always going to involve some kind of grip. If Mateus just stepped around my legs with no grip on me, it's the easiest thing in the world for me to face him again. There's no real threat. The threat comes when Matheus starts to get grips on my body. Here, he's chosen lapel and pant. With the lapel grip, he can push my shoulders back, and from here, he can put my shoulders on the ground, okay? Here, he's taken the same grip, but instead, he pushes my shoulders back and goes long stepping around my guard. Here, he takes the same grip, but he pushes my shoulders back and sends my legs through, and goes in for a variety of X passes, etc., etc. So one grip has given him 3 very simple guard passing methodologies. As soon as he got a hold of that grip, he controlled my movement. And you could see he was doing something with my hips and shoulders. He was putting my shoulders behind my hips, where I'm not very effective. In most forms of butterfly guard, I need my shoulders in front of my hips. So that lapel grip immediately put me at a disadvantage when my shoulders went behind my hips. And that made my legs very light. So when he pushes my legs to the side, it's very easy for him to start passing now. He used 3 different guard passes out of one grip. You can see that the grip was the prerequisite to the various forms of pass. So one of the best ways for us to shut down our opponent's ability to pass our guard is to shut down his ability to grip us. If he can't make an effective grip, it's very, very difficult to pass somebody's guard. Now, a word to the wise. There is a danger that when you go out to just attack your opponent's grip, you can become an overly negative guard player, where you're simply breaking his grips and not focusing on your own attacks. You don't want that. Ultimately, you want to be able to defeat people from guard position, not just to hold them off. So let's keep in mind that even though I am an advocate of breaking grips, don't get so negative in your guard game that all you're interested in is just breaking grips and never doing anything positive. At some point, you've got to go out and attack the guy. You've got to play a positive game of beating him rather than just not being beaten by him. So always bear in mind, as much as I do advocate the use of grip breaking as an effective means of retaining guard, don't use it to the extent where it's all you're doing from guard position bottom. At some point, you've got to go beyond breaking grips and go out and make grips on him and go into attack. Let's have a look at the idea of breaking grips. We'll do it first just to show you a position where most people learn grip breaking is in standing position. If my opponent comes out and makes a grip on my lapel, it's a common thing for us to shrug a grip off in these positions and go to work. If we're gripping like so, there's a multitude of methods where we can go to take an opponent's grip off and break in a grip in the standing position. We can do similar things on the ground, but it's a little more difficult. In the standing position, grip breaking is relatively easy because we can change the distance between ourselves. As Matheus is at a certain distance, if I increase the distance, it's relatively easy for us now to break our training partner's grips and then from here go to work our own grips. It was easy because I can change the distance between myself and my opponent. From standing position, even if I don't use 2 hands, it's relatively simple for me to change distance by jackknifing my hips. And from here, as distance changes, it's easy for us to go in and break our training partner's grips. That changes when we're down on the ground. On the ground, I don't have the same ability to move my body back and break grips. So typically, what you're going to find is that grip breaking at the upper body is more difficult on the ground than it is in the standing position. However, it's very easy to break grips on your pants because your pants can change distance. Well, not your pants, your legs inside your pants can change distance on the floor. So say, for example, Matheus has a hold of my gi pants, okay? It's not a difficult thing for me to get a hold of my training partner's legs like so, and I can change the distance by pulling with my hands and pushing with my legs. And as a result, grip breaks with the legs are relatively simple. Even if we're static down on the floor, someone goes from 2 knees to grab a hold of my gi pants, it's not a difficult thing to break the grips on the gi pants just by pulling out like so, okay? Pant grips are relatively easy to break from guard position. However, upper body grips can be very difficult because I can't change distance between myself and my opponent now. When he gets a good grip here, it's much more difficult to break from here than it would be from standing position. Here I can move back and away from my opponent. Okay? So a good rule of thumb, this is a rule of thumb, it's not an iron cast rule, but a good rule of thumb is that if someone goes to grab my gi pants, I will often go to attack grips because they're relatively easy to break. Even if my opponent gets a good bunch of cloth in here, okay? It's not that difficult for me to come through and break a grip on my gi pants. However, if someone goes to grip here, rather than using very difficult to employ gi breaks up here, I would rather learn to negate upper body grips, okay? So as my opponent goes to pass in situations like this, I will use a foot inside my training partner's bicep. Now when he goes to throw my legs by, there's a good connection to him, okay? So the general rule which I offer you when we're working from guard position is that we break grips upon our pants and we negate grips upon our upper body. In the standing position, we use breaks on the upper body because we can change distance between ourselves and our opponent. But that's impossible when we're working from guard position. So as a general rule, we tend to negate upper body grips when we're in bottom position guard, and when those grips are on the upper body, and we tend to break grips on the pants. So if we have an opponent here, he goes into Toreando. If I'm intimidated by the grip that he has, one good method here is going to be to break those grips. Look how I can pull with my hand and break my training partner's grip, and then from here go into various forms of attack on our training partner. Okay, but if he has an upper body grip here, it would be unrealistic for me to try and break a grip under those circumstances. So a better way for us to act here might be to simply negate our training partner's grip. So now when he goes into a knee slice or what have you, it's going to be difficult because we have the inside position on our training partner's bicep like so. So the general rule which I offer you from bottom guard position, we can break, you don't have to, but you can break pants upon your, grips upon your pants, but it's much more difficult to break grips on your upper body and lapels. So we tend to negate upper body grips and break lower body grips. That's a good rule of thumb for you to use when it comes time to negating and breaking the various grips that your opponent will use against you, and you're looking to maintain your guard. I'm sure you've been playing jiu-jitsu long enough to look around the gym or look at footage of great guard players, and you see something very, very obvious. You see that people who have good guard retention always seem to know something. They know when they should be defensive and they know when they should be offensive. And you can always see a beginner in the gym and you see them going for an offensive move when really they should be in a defensive mindset. And as a result, they quickly and easily get their guard passed. What's the difference? Why is it that some people can feel a situation or sense a situation and they know that this is a time to be defensive and focus on guard retention, and then another situation they know that it's the right time to be offensive and they go out and attack their opponent? Why do they never get confused, whereas beginners always seem to get confused and as a result quickly get their guard passed? We're about to explain that now. What I want to give you is a very easy to understand guide as to when you should be in an offensive mindset from guard position and when you should be in a defensive mindset. And it all comes down to a set of simple, easy to understand demarcation lines that give you a crystal clear guide as to what you should be doing at any given second in a guard passing versus guard retention exchange. Let's look at a situation where Mateus is down on his back and he's facing me in some form of open guard. Okay, let's understand that his body has certain demarcation lines on it which are critical, and once they're understood, give him a very clear sense of what he ought to be doing at any given moment in a guard passer versus guard defender exchange. The first line of demarcation has to do with distance, and this is my opponent's toe line. This is the line that joins Mateus's two toes. Okay, what's the importance of this toe line? It governs the distance between myself and my opponent. I, as the guard passer, have to take into account the toe line as the first barrier to which I need to come forward. And it will govern the relationship between myself and my opponent. If I step clumsily beyond the toe line, too quickly, unsupported, my opponent easily gets inside position, forms a connection to my body, and now he's in an offensive mindset. He can go into attack me. Okay? If I clumsily step inside, I give him De La Riva guard, connection, and now he's ready to start attacking me. Okay? I overstep a critical boundary, this toe line, and I gave him easy connection to my body and offensive possibilities as a result. So as a passer, I use the toe line as the fundamental measure as I come towards my opponent and start putting grips on my opponent, whether they be gi grips or no gi grips or what have you. Okay, that's my first fundamental measure. Another critical demarcation line is Mateus's knee line. The knee line is particularly interesting because unlike some of the other lines of my opponent's body, the knee line and toe line can rapidly move and change. Okay, the knee line is interesting because of its relationship with another critical line of my opponent's body, the hip line, the line that joins my training partner's two hips. The hip line will ultimately turn out to be probably the single most important measure in all of guard passing. Okay, we're going to be coming back to it very soon. But let's first investigate the relationship between Mateus's knee line and Mateus's hip line. Okay, from his perspective, if Mateus's knees are behind the hip line, he's in a strong defensive structure where he can easily join his elbows and knees together and form very good, strong frames, which can easily hold my body weight up and sustain me. Okay, but the moment Mateus's knee line starts going beyond his hip line, something terrible starts to happen. Chest exposure. And that chest exposure can be used by a guard passer to generate a strong guard pass. Okay? So as the guard defender, Mateus has to be very conscious of the relationship between his knee line and his hip line. And he has to be conscious of the fact that he's taking a risk as the knees extend past the hip line. Now that risk may be quite acceptable if he has a good connection to me. So if he has, for example, De La Riva guard, that's a good form of connection. And if he has a lapel grip, it's also a good form of connection. And so it's safe for him now to take a risk with this leg and extend it beyond his hip line. But if Mateus had no connection to me and he started extending his legs, it's so easy from here for me to whip past his legs and start going on the attack. So you can see the relationship between knee line and hip line is very, very important for the guard defender. In general, the less connection that Mateus has to me, the more he has to keep his knee line above his hip line. And the more connection he has to me, the more he can start taking risks and extending his knee line out beyond his hip line. So this is another very, very important line of demarcation to understand as the guard retainer or guard defender. Now, I said earlier that of all the lines of demarcation, arguably the most important is the hip line. Okay? Why? Because the hip line is the fundamental measure of whether or not you have passed your opponent's guard or not. When I go to pass my training partner's guard, I have a lead leg and a trail leg. If my lead leg steps beyond my opponent's hip line, it doesn't mean much. It doesn't have a lot of significance because my opponent can still tie into my body. He can easily go into a gi. He's got Ashigarami variations, X-guard variations, all kinds of things he can do. But I have two legs. And if my lead leg passes the hip line and then my trail leg passes the hip line, now you got a serious problem. Okay? Once my trail leg either goes here, knee on his belly, or knee on the floor, you are officially in a very, very strong guard passing position. If I can combine my trail leg past his hip line and chest-to-chest contact and hold this for 3 seconds, you have officially passed your opponent's guard. So the hip line is the fundamental measure. It's the relationship between my trail knee and his hip line. If my trail knee gets to his hip line and my chest gets to his chest, and you hold it for 3 seconds, you've passed his guard. So the whole battle of guard retention versus guard passing is the battle of my trail knee and his hip line. Understand that, and you'll understand what's going on in the dynamic of the guard pass. So as we work in situations here, this is a critical situation for Mateus. My trail knee is on his hip line. The only thing between me passing him now is this distance between his chest and mine. This is the time for Mateus to start putting on emergency frames. And from here, he's got to move his body in such a way that his center line lines up with me now. And I'm no longer parked on his hip line. As much as possible, I want to create situations in all guard passing where I threaten my opponent's hip line. That's my measure. I'm always looking to get my trail leg to his hip line. Okay? The hip line represents the single most important demarcation point in all of guard passing. And my goal, regardless of whether he's seated or standing, is always my trail leg to his hip line. If I get there, I'm immediately putting my opponent under extreme threat. And he has to react to this. He cannot accept this. From here, he's got to start bringing legs back in, doing whatever he wants to invert or what have you, and put me back in guard. Now, so far, I'm just standing up the test. All the lines is facing the camera. All the lines we've looked at have been horizontal lines. They were lines at the toes, lines at the knees, and lines at the hip. Okay? There is another horizontal line that we'll just look at now, the shoulder line. Okay, lying down, Mateus. The shoulder line is important for various forms of toreando passing, where sometimes we'll go past the hip line and we'll step over the shoulder line, like so we can rotate our training partner's body. And this has a specialized use in various forms of toreando passing. All these lines, back up, Mateus, are horizontal lines. So we had toe line, knee line, hip line, and shoulder line. Now there are also vertical lines, which are extremely important. Okay, the most obvious one is center line. Ultimately, the goal of the guard defender is always to align his center line with his opponent. And if you can do that, no one's ever going to pass your guard. So every act of guard retention is the act of getting my center line aligned with his again. And there are two other lines, the side lines. A side line is the line that runs from the shoulder to the hip. And of course, you have two of them, one on your left and one on your right. So in this theory of demarcation lines, we have toe line, knee line, hip line, and shoulder line. Those are our horizontal lines. And we have three vertical lines, center line, right side line, and left side line. Now, lying down, Mateus. As long as Mateus has his center line lined up with mine, I'll never pass his guard. So my whole game is to get my body, as the passer, is to get my body outside of his sideline. Here. I am currently outside of Mateus' sideline. If I'm in this position, Mateus has to react to this. If he doesn't react to it, I'll pass every single time. So of course, he has to bring legs in and realign his center line with me once more. If I move outside his left sideline, he's got to bring his legs back in and realign his center line with me. Okay? The critical intersection point, and this is the most important part out of all these lines of demarcation we looked at, there's an intersection point of two lines. This is the target zone for me as the guard passer. It's the intersection of his sideline and his hip line. That intersection point between, in this case, right sideline and hip line is my target as a guard passer. If I get to that point with my trail leg, I have Mateus in a critical situation where the only thing between me and a guard pass is his frames. And how we react to those frames determines whether or not I'll pass or not. If I can beat the frames, I'm going to pass. If I can't, he will bring legs back in, get back center line to center line, and we're back in neutral position and ready to play the guard passing game all over again. Let's understand the importance of these simple demarcation lines and how they will be ultimately the determining factor in whether or not you understand what you should be doing. And lie down, buddy. Knees in. Good. Like so. As I go to approach an opponent, Mateus currently sees there is almost no threat because we're center line to center line. The second Mateus sees me take a step outside, okay, I have passed one of his lines of demarcation. I've passed his right sideline. However, I've done nothing to threaten the hip line, so there's really very little threat. Mateus can just shuffle his body around to face me, and the threat is over. If I step directly to the side, I've gone outside his left sideline, but I haven't closed distance. I haven't gone towards his hip line. So again, there's minimal threat, and he soon turns and faces me. Okay. If I simply step forward naively, without any form of angle, I've actually given him something good. I gave him an easy entry into my legs. So that was naivety on my part. What makes me dangerous as a guard player is not forward and sideward movement, but rather the combination of the two, because that puts me in the magic zone of the intersection of sideline and hip line. And when we get used to the idea that when we step to this position, now you're a dangerous passer. Because I've gotten close with my trail leg to the intersection of sideline and hip line, this is a crisis situation for Mateus. He cannot ignore what has just happened, and neither can you. Red lights, red warning lights are going off anytime my trail leg threatens that critical intersection line, the sideline and the hip line. Whatever you're doing from guard position, at this point, you've got to stop and address this threat. The closer my trail leg gets to that intersection point, the worse things are for the guy on bottom. Okay? So you can create a kind of an early warning radar from your guard position as to whether or not there's a serious threat or not, based on these simple lines of demarcation. If it's center line to center line, there is no threat. You're fine. Everything's good. Okay? If my opponent simply steps out to the side, there's a minor threat, and you can easily address that and put the guy back in. But the moment I start to threaten with my rear leg, that critical point of the intersection of hip line and sideline, that's a serious threat, a very serious one. And you must stop whatever you're doing. There's no thought of offense now. You're not thinking about submission holds, sweeps. You're thinking about, okay, stop what you're doing and put this guy back in guard. So the frames go up, the hips go out, the legs come in, and now we're center line to center line. And now Mateus can go into an offensive mindset. Now he can start thinking about submission holds. Now he can start thinking about sweeps. He can do whatever he wants now. Okay? When you're center line to center line, you're in an offensive mode. But whenever your opponent is threatening the intersection of sideline and hip line, you are in a 100% defensive mode. And your only concern is forming frames and generating movement that enable you to get back to center line, and from here we go to do all of our work. This simple understanding based around lines of demarcation is the basis of why some people have incredible guards, which are almost impossible to pass, because they know exactly, based on these simple lines, when and where they should be offensive and when and where they should be defensive.